Disassembly of S-AMT transmission assembly. Precautions for disassembling transmission. 1. Clean the transmission housing thoroughly before opening the transmission. 2. Prepare necessary disassembly tools and special tools before disassembling. 3. When disassembling, all parts should be placed on a clean workbench in an orderly disassembly manner. All parts should be handled with care to avoid bumping. The surfaces of parts shall be kept clean and free of dirt, iron filings, etc. 4. Pay attention to the magnitude of the force applied to the parts during the disassembly, and do not knock violently to avoid damage to the parts. 1. Draining the oil. 1. Remove the oil filler bolt with a 17mm socket. 2. Remove the oil drain plug with a 17mm socket. 3. Remove the bolts from the filter screen and cover with a 13mm socket. And detach the filter screen and cover, O-ring, and filter screen. 2. Removing harness and air pipes. 1. Cut off the harness binding strap. 2. Push forward the locking slide a plug of the XY actuator cable in parallel and remove the cable connector. 3. Push forward the locking slide a plug of the range gear cylinder and the split gear cylinder cable in parallel and remove the cable connectors. 4. Remove the harness connectors of the input shaft speed sensor and output shaft speed sensor. 5. Remove the harness bracket bolt with a 16mm socket. And detach the harness assembly. 6. Remove the gear selector and shift the air pipes in sequence with a 19mm wrench. The split gear and range gear cylinder air pipes. And the PCA and TB air pipes. Three. Removing the XY actuator. 1. Remove the fixing bolts from the XY actuator with a 13mm socket and detach the bracket, XY actuator, and gasket. 2. Remove the fixing bolts from the adapter plate with an 8mm hex socket driver and detach the adapter plate and gasket. 4. Removing retarder assembly. 1. Remove the bolts and nuts with 21mm and 22mm wrenches. 2. remove the retarder assembly with a lifting tool. Five, removing the PTO assembly. 1. Remove the hollow bolts of the PTO oil inlet pipe and auxiliary transmission oil inlet pipe with 14 mm and 22 mm sockets, and detach the oil pipes and hollow bolts. 2. Remove the PTO fixing bolt with a 16 mm socket and detach the PTO. 3. Remove the connecting bolts of the PTO front housing with 16 mm and 18 mm socket. And detach the PTO front housing. 4. Remove the gasket, O-ring, and spline shaft assembly. 6. Removing the accessories inside front housing. 1. Remove the fork shaft grease nozzle assembly within 11 mm range. 2. Remove the fork shaft bracket bolt with a 16 mm socket. And detach the bracket and the release fork. 2. Remove the hollow bolts of the TB oil inlet pipe with a 14 mm socket. 3. Remove the hollow bolts of the oil pipe with a 22 mm socket. And detach the oil pipe assembly. 4. Remove the hollow bolts of the TB brake air pipe with a 17 mm socket. 5. Remove the brake bolt with a 16 mm socket. And detach the TB brake. 6. Lifting pin and spring. 6. Remove the input shaft and cover bolt with a 16 mm socket and detach the input shaft and cover assembly. 7. Remove the oil pump fixing bolt with a 16 mm socket and detach the oil pump assembly. 8. Remove the left and right countershaft bearings, as well as the input shaft bearing stop rings with circular pliers. 7. Removing the auxiliary transmission assembly. 1. Remove the hexagon socket bolt with an 8 mm hex socket driver and detach the spring and steel ball. 2. Remove the bolts of the split gear cylinder with a 16 mm socket and detach the cylinder. 3. Remove the nut with position sensor pin rod by using a 24 mm wrench and detach the piston. 4. Remove the connecting bolts between the rear and middle housings with a 16 mm socket. 5. 5. Lift the auxiliary transmission assembly down by using an auxiliary transmission lifting device. 6. Remove the transmission inner tube. 8. Removing the middle housing, main shaft, and countershaft assemblies. 1. Remove the sun gear and spline sleeve assembly. 2. Remove the fixing bolts of the idler shaft with a 16 mm socket and detach the bolts and pressing plates. 3. Remove the left and right idler shafts with an idler shaft extractor. And be careful to move the idler away from the main shaft gear. 4. Remove the fixing bolt of the input shaft speed sensor with a 10 mm socket. 5. Remove the fixing nut between the rear and middle housings with a 16 mm wrench. 6. Lift down the middle housing assembly with a lifting device. 7. And detach the idler assembly. 7. Remove the transmission inner tube 1. 8. Lift down the main shaft and countershaft assemblies and each fork shaft assembly with a special tool. 9. Disassembly of main shaft and input shaft assembly. 1. Remove the reverse fork shaft assembly, the first and second fork shaft assembly, the third and fourth fork shaft assembly, the range and split fork shaft assembly, and the fork sliding pads, and detach the left and right countershaft assemblies. 2. Remove the reverse gear sliding sleeve. 3. Hex key. 3. Turn the reverse gear to align the main shaft gear spacer teeth with the main shaft gear groove, and remove the reverse gear and the main shaft gear spacer. 4. Remove the main shaft gear spacer after turning it. 5. And detach the first gear. 5. Remove the main shaft gear spacer after turning it. 6. Remove the main shaft sliding sleeve. 7. Turn the second gear, remove it and the main shaft gear spacer. 8. Remove the main shaft gear spacer after turning it and detach the third gear. 9. Remove the main shaft gear spacer after turning it. 10. Remove the main shaft sliding sleeve. 11. Contract the securing ring between the main shaft and the input shaft with special circlip pliers and remove the main shaft. 12. Remove the locating nut with a 36 mm socket. 13. Remove the washer and small thrust bearing. 14. Remove the thrust bearing race and connecting circlip assembly, needle bearing, and large thrust bearing. 15. Remove the constant driving gear, high. Cone hub, large thrust bearing, and washer. 16. Remove the synchronizer ring, synchronizer sliding sleeve, push block, and inner and outer springs. 17. Remove the circlip with circlip pliers and detach the gear seat, synchronizer ring, and cone hub. 18. After turning the input shaft by 180 degrees, use circlip pliers to remove the elastic retainer ring for the shaft. 19. Use a special tool to remove the input shaft bearing, and the constant driving gear, low. Disassembly of auxiliary transmission assembly. 1. Use M10 bolt to push down forward torsion shafts. 2. Remove the lock plate with a chisel. 3. Remove the large bolt with a 60 mm socket. 4. Screw in the large bolt after removing the pressure plate. And use a special tool to remove the output flange. Five. Remove the bolts of the range gear cylinder with a 16 mm socket and detach the range gear cylinder. 6. Remove the nut with position sensor pin rod with a 24 mm wrench and detach the piston. 7. Remove the odometer sensor with a 27 mm socket. 8. Remove the fixing bolt of the output shaft speed sensor with a 10 mm socket. 8. Remove the output shaft rear end cover bolt with a 13mm and 16mm socket and detach the rear end cover. 9. Remove the rear housing with a special tool. Pay attention to the range fork shaft and remove the fork shaft assembly and fork sliding pads. Remove the spacer, sensor ring gear, bearing, oil guide ring, and high gear cone hub assembly with special tools. Remove the synchronizer ring. 11. Remove the synchronizer sliding sleeve, push block, and inner and outer springs. 12. Remove the circlip with circlip pliers. 13. Remove the synchronizer gear seat, synchronizer ring, and low gear cone hub assembly. 14. Remove the ring gear carrier, inner ring gear assembly. 15. Spacer.